students, before we go on to chapter 5, I want to kind of review what we've seen so far in our novel, The Miraculous Journey of Edward Tulane, and talk a little bit about what's going on and some of our main characters. So in the very first page, we learn a lot about Edward and the kind of rabbit that he is. The very first paragraphs say, "Once in a house on Egypt Street, there lived a rabbit who was made almost entirely of china. He had china arms and china legs, china paws and a china head, a china torso and a china nose. His arms and legs were jointed and joined by wire, so that his china elbows and china knees could be bent, giving him much freedom of movement. His ears were made of real rabbit fur, and beneath the fur there were strong bendable wires, which allowed the ears to be arranged into poses that reflected the rabbit's mood, jaunty, tired, full of ennui. His tail, too, was made of real rabbit fur and was fluffy and soft and well-shaped. The rabbit's name was Edward Tulane, and he was tall. He measured almost 3 feet from the tip of his ears to the tip of his feet. His eyes were painted a penetrating and intelligent blue." So if we look at what the author is describing here, I'm getting the picture of a really special, very, very nice rabbit. First of all, he's made of china. So that gives me the idea that maybe this takes place some time ago, because most of our dolls today, our Barbie dolls, our Samantha Girl dolls, our G.I. Joes, are made of plastic. But this rabbit is made almost entirely of china. And china is a very fragile material that can break when it's dropped. If you have in your house, you might have a really special set of plates and glasses and teacups made of china. And in my house, I have a set like that. We only use them for really special occasions, like Thanksgiving, Christmas, birthdays sometimes. And we don't use them very often because they are so very nice and they can break so easily. And this rabbit is made of that really fragile material. Also, his ears have real rabbit fur around them. Again, you don't see that very often in dolls today, and that I'm thinking is probably expensive and makes him special. And lastly, he's really tall. He's probably almost as tall as you are. So he's not just a tiny little thing. He's quite big. He's the size really of a yardstick, if you think about a yardstick. So this makes me think that this is, right off the bat, this rabbit is a really special rabbit. He's not just your everyday, ordinary thing. So if I go on, we learn some more things about Edward. I like how on this page here, it says, Abeline's father would turn in the direction of Edward's ears and speak slowly, repeating what he had just said for the benefit of the china rabbit. Edward pretended, out of courtesy to Abeline, to listen, but in truth, he was not very interested in what people had to say, and also he did not care for Abeline's parents and their condescending manner toward him. All adults, in fact, condescended to him. So condescended means you kind of talk down to someone. So he's saying that Edward's parents don't treat him like an equal. They don't talk to him like he's their friend. They talk to him almost like he's a baby, and they need to speak slowly so that he can understand, and repeat things so that he can understand. So that tells me that Edward is pretty smart, and he wants to be treated like an equal to people, even though he's really just a toy. So this whole book is written like Charlotte's Web was, from the perspective of personification. This is a doll. We know that dolls don't talk and have thoughts and have feelings. So personification is when we take something and give it those adult characters. And Edward is an example of that. Interestingly, Edward goes on to say that only Abeline's grandmother spoke to him as Abeline did, as one equal to another. Pellegrina was very old. She had large, sharp nose, bright black eyes that shone like dark stars. It was Pellegrina who was responsible for Edward's existence. It was she who had commissioned his making, she who had ordered his silk hats and his pocket watch, his jaunty hats and his bendable ears, his fine leather shoes and his jointed arms and legs, all from a master craftsman in her native France. It was Pellegrina who had given him as a gift to Abilene on her 7th birthday. So Pellegrina is Abilene's grandmother, and she had Edward specially made with silk suits and a pocket watch and fine leather shoes. So again, this is telling us that Edward is pretty special, and Abilene's grandmother Pellegrina had him made specially for Abilene for her birthday. So if we go on and look at what happens next, we know that we also learn some things about where Edward is and where Abilene lives. So in these pages, we see that Abilene comes home for him, and that Abilene also has a maid. And so the maid vacuumed Edward Tulane. She sucked up each of his long ears up the vacuum cleaner hose. She pawed at his clothes and beat his tail. She dusted his face with brutality and efficiency. So again, all of this tells me about where Edward is and what he's doing, okay? So I'm thinking that Abilene's family must have some money, because they have a rabbit as fancy and as nice as Edward Tulane. They have a maid, and this tells me something about Edward Tulane. He doesn't like being sucked up into the vacuum cleaner. She dusted his face with brutality, which means is like ferocity. She's being not gentle. She's being kind of rough and mean with him. And Edward clearly doesn't like that, based on the language that we see. And then the last thing that I want to talk about here is the story that Pellegrina tells Abilene. Okay, and the story starts with, once there was a princess who was very beautiful. She shone as bright as the stars on a moonless night. But what difference did it make that she was beautiful? None. No difference. Why did it make no difference? Asked Abilene. Because, said Pellegrina, she was a princess who loved no one and cared nothing for love, even though there were many who loved her. At this point in her story, Pellegrina stopped and looked right at Edward. She stared deep into his painted-on eyes, and again Edward felt a shiver go through him. You know, sometimes authors write things into their story to give us clues and to give us hints about what's going to happen in the future. And I find it very interesting that Pellegrina chooses to tell a story about a princess who loved no one and cared nothing for love. And that right after Pellegrina says this, she stops and she looks right at Edward. And I'm wondering, why did the author choose these words? And why did the author choose this story? And I'm thinking that maybe it's a hint. Maybe it's a hint about Edward and his character and his traits. And maybe it's a hint about something that's going to happen in the future. But I don't know yet. We're going to have to see. So Pellegrina tells Abilene this story about her princess and the princess's love. And they go on. And after Pellegrina finishes telling the story, she says this to Edward. She says, Pellegrina took Edward from Abilene. She put him in his bed and pulled the sheet up to his whiskers. She leaned close to him and she whispered, "You disappoint me." Why would Edward disappoint Pellegrina. I mean, he's just a rabbit. He doesn't really talk to Abilene and Pellegrina. They don't know what he's thinking, do they? I'm starting to wonder about that, because Pellegrina told this story about a girl who doesn't understand how to love someone. And here's Edward, and she says to Edward, you disappoint me. And I wonder if the two are connected. Those two things are connected. Why does Edward disappoint him? I'm sorry, why does Edward disappoint Pellegrina? Does Pellegrina see into Edward's thoughts? Can Edward really love someone? Based on the story and what we've seen about Edward's thoughts and what he says, do you think that Edward does know how to love? And then later on in this chapter, I found this really interesting too. Edward said, Abilene, I love you. I don't care how old I get. I will always love you. Yes, yes, thought Edward. He continued to stare up at the ceiling. He was agitated, which means kind of upset and worried for some reason that he could not name. He wished that Pellegrina had put him on his side so that he might look at the stars. If you had someone tell you how much they loved you, would your response be, yes, yes? What does that tell us about Edward? Does he care about Abilene as much as she cares about him? And maybe that's what Pellegrina is talking about. But again, we're not sure yet. We're going to have to see. So in our next video, we're going to go on to read chapter 5 for this next week.